Chapter 1. Tea at the Willowbrook Fete. The afternoon sun lay softly upon the green of Willowbrook, a village so peacefully contented that even its church bells seemed to ring with discretion. Beneath the fluttering bunting of the annual summer fete, the inhabitants moved about in gentle bustle, tea-urns steaming, sponge cakes displayed like trophies, and the village brass band valiantly struggling through Rule Britannia. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small table beside the vicarage garden gate, poured herself another cup of weak tea. She had volunteered, as she often did, to help with the judging of the preserves. A more exacting duty than many imagined, for deceit, she knew, began in small ways. A woman who passed off bought marmalade as homemade might very well conceal more serious falsehoods under her neat hat. "Splendid turnout, Miss Marple," called Mr. Harcourt, the postmaster, as he passed with his wife. "Even a visitor from London, I hear. A writer, no less." Miss Marple looked up with mild curiosity. "Oh, how interesting. I hope he enjoys our modest amusements." "Seems fascinated by everything," said Mrs. Harcourt, lowering her voice. "Been asking all manner of questions about the history of the old inn. The Black Cat, you know. Says he's doing some sort of research." "The Black Cat," murmured Miss Marple, stirring her tea. "A most curious name. I always thought it a rather sinister one for so cheerful a building." "It was cheerful once," said Mrs. Harcourt significantly, "until old Mrs. Penfold died there. Heart failure, they said. But you know how people talk." Indeed they did. In Willowbrook, gossip was the natural air one breathed. Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled faintly, though she said nothing more. She had learned that when information desired itself revealed, it would do so, sooner rather than later. A short distance away, the London visitor was indeed holding court. He was a tall, angular gentleman with a scholar's stoop and a restless, alert expression. His name, it appeared, was Mr. Edwin Stratton, and his conversation glittered with references to criminal method, deductive reasoning, and the psychology of evil. He claimed to be writing a comparative study on the techniques of famous detectives, real and fictional. "It is extraordinary," he was saying to the rector, "how a single misplaced clue, a footprint, a burnt match, can unravel the mind of a killer. I often think of Sherlock Holmes and his astonishing precision. A pity he was never real." Miss Marple, catching the remark as she passed, paused with polite interest. "Oh, I don't know," she said in her gentle, uncertain voice. "I dare say there are many such persons who never trouble to make themselves known. Observation, after all, is a matter of habit, not profession." Stratton turned, intrigued. "You speak as if from experience." "Madam." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh dear, no, only from life. One sees a great deal in a village, Mr. Stratton, far more than one wishes to at times." The writer gave her a sharp glance, and laughed. "Quite so. I must visit your village more often, Miss." "Marple," she supplied. "Jane Marple." "Ah, then I shall hope to claim your insight on a small matter tomorrow. I'm lodging at the Black Cat. There's a local legend that intrigues me. Perhaps you can confirm or deny it." Miss Marple inclined her head, her curiosity delicately piqued. "Legends," she said, "are often but memories in disguise." The fete ended pleasantly enough, though a summer wind stirred the trees with odd persistence, as though something uneasy whispered through the leaves. By evening the bunting hung limp, the tea-things were packed away, and the laughter of children had faded down the lane. At the Black Cat Inn, however, lights still burned. Inside, Mr. Stratton sat at a small table in the public parlour, his notebook open beside a half-finished glass of port. He was writing intently, lips moving faintly as he muttered observations. A sudden draught flickered the candles. He frowned and turned, but no one stood behind him, only the door swinging gently on its hinges. Mrs. Penfold's old cat, black as soot with one white paw, slipped silently into the room and leapt onto a chair. Stratton chuckled. "Well, well, a fitting mascot for the place. You'll keep me company, eh?" The cat's golden eyes regarded him steadily. Outside, the church clock struck 9, then 10, then 11, and at midnight the guests at the Black Cat were awakened by a terrible crash. A sound like overturned furniture and shattering glass, followed by silence. When the innkeeper and two boarders rushed downstairs, they found the parlor door locked from within. When they broke it open, they discovered Mr. Edwin Stratton slumped across his desk, his pen still clutched in hand, his expression frozen in startled disbelief. The only other living soul in the room was the cat, sitting perfectly still on the windowsill, tail curling around its paws. In the morning, the entire village of Willowbrook was abuzz. A London man, dead, and mysteriously so, at the Black Cat. Some said heart failure, others whispered of poison, and some, lowering their voices even further, wondered if the curse of the inn had returned. Miss Marple, in her small parlor overlooking the churchyard, added an extra spoon of sugar to her tea and thought quietly. "Heart failure," she murmured. "Yes, they always say that, don't they?" Chapter 2. The Village That Whispers. By breakfast the next morning, the news had run through Willowbrook like spilt tea across a linen cloth. A London man, dead at the Black Cat Inn. Mrs. Finch, who kept the bakery, had heard it first from the milkman, who had it from the innkeeper's nephew, who had been on the scene not 10 minutes after it happened. By the time Miss Marple stepped out to fetch her morning paper, the tale had grown as full-bodied as the morning fog. They say his face was quite blue. No, white as a sheet. And the cat was sitting right on his shoulder, so I'm told, just like in the legend. Miss Marple listened with her usual gentle attention, nodding at intervals. She knew well that truth, when passed from mouth to mouth, rarely arrived at its destination in one piece. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called the vicar's wife from across the lane. "Such a dreadful business. Poor man. To think one never knows who one's talking to, does one?" "No, indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "One never does." The police arrive. By mid-morning, a motor car stood outside the inn, its presence drawing half the village to the green. From it emerged Inspector Crail, a square man with an expression of habitual skepticism, and Sergeant Wills, who looked rather more uncomfortable than his superior. Crail was not new to the countryside, but he had the air of a man who disliked its soft manners and slower pace. "Heart failure, possibly," he muttered, surveying the little crowd. "But we'll have a proper look. These country folk see ghosts behind every hedge." Inside the inn's parlor, the scene had been tidied just enough to preserve its solemnity. Mr. Stratton's body had been carried upstairs, leaving only a faint scent of tobacco and candle wax. The cat was nowhere to be seen. "Locked from the inside, you say?" asked Crail. "Yes, sir," said the innkeeper. "We had to break it open. Poor gentleman looked as though he just stopped." Crail grunted. "Any sign of struggle?" "None, sir. His glass was half full, pen in hand. He'd been writing." The inspector bent over the writing desk. The open notebook lay before him, a page filled in Stratton's neat, hurried script, but a large ink blot obscured the last line. "Get this sent up to the lab," he ordered, "and take that port glass too. Can't rule out poison." As the sergeant obeyed, Miss Marple appeared quietly in the doorway. She had brought a posy of garden flowers, a gesture of sympathy, she said, for poor Mrs. Dawlish, the innkeeper's wife, who was quite overcome. Inspector Crail glanced up. "Good morning, madam. I'm afraid this isn't a place for visitors." "Oh, quite," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I was merely passing, and I thought perhaps I might be of some use. I was here yesterday, you see. I spoke with Mr. Stratton." The inspector's expression softened slightly. Small, elderly ladies with gentle manners rarely struck him as troublemakers. "Did you, now? What about?" "Oh, nothing of importance," Miss Marple said, in the tone of one remembering trivialities. "He mentioned he was writing a book about detectives. He seemed very interested in people's habits. Observation, he called it." Crail grunted. "Writers. Always poking about where they shouldn't. Well, we'll know soon enough. If you noticed anything strange, Miss, she corrected gently. Marple? Yes, of course, Miss Marple. If you noticed anything, she hesitated delicately, only that he seemed rather pleased with himself, as though he had just discovered something. Crail made a note. Thank you. That'll be all for now." Miss Marple inclined her head and left with quiet grace. Outside she paused on the cobbled path, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The black cat sign creaked faintly in the wind above her head, its painted feline arched in mid-hiss. There was something curious about that inn. She had always thought so, and she could not quite rid herself of the feeling that Mr. Stratton's discovery, whatever it had been, had cost him his life. Gossip at the tea-table. That afternoon, tea at Mrs. Price's became the unofficial tribunal of public opinion. There were 5 ladies present, each with a cup and an opinion. Mrs. Price, Mrs. Harcourt, Miss Blythe, the rector's wife, and Miss Marple. "It must have been poison," declared Mrs. Price. "They always say heart failure when it's poison. I read it in the papers once." "Or suicide," said Miss Blythe eagerly. "Those London writers are very peculiar people. Perhaps he was melancholy." "Melancholy men don't order sponge cake and inquire about village legends," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Then what do you think, Miss Marple?" asked the vicar's wife, half in dread, half in hope. Miss Marple smiled faintly, eyes on her teacup. "Oh, I don't think anything yet. But I always find that when people die unexpectedly, it is seldom the first time something surprising has happened to them. There are usually rehearsals." "Rehearsals?" Mrs. Price repeated. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Little events that go unnoticed. A quarrel, a missing key, a letter misplaced. People often prepare for their crimes, you know, just as others prepare for tea." A thoughtful silence followed. Even the ticking clock seemed to listen. Then the door opened abruptly, and young Tom Dawlish, the innkeeper's nephew, entered looking pale and anxious. "Miss Marple," he said breathlessly, "Inspector Crale's asking for you. Says you might help him make sense of something." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple, setting down her cup with calm precision. "How very obliging of him. I shall come at once." The clue in the notebook. When she returned to the Black Cat, the inspector stood at the writing desk, frowning. "Found this, Miss Marple. Thought perhaps your eye might catch what mine doesn't." He handed her a sheet of paper from Stratton's notebook, the page marred by the blot of ink. Beneath the stain 3 words were still legible. "Oh, like Holmes's Black Cat." Miss Marple looked up. "Holmes's Black Cat?" "Yes. Some nonsense, I imagine. Literary reference, perhaps." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "though it reminds me rather of something else. In stories, black cats rarely mean what they seem. Nor do writers who come to villages for research." She replaced the page gently. "Tell me, Inspector, did you happen to notice if Mr. Stratton wore gloves last night?" Crale blinked. "Gloves? No. Why?" "Oh, no reason," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "Only that a man who keeps ink-stained fingers cannot easily hide where he has been." That night, as the rain began to fall softly upon Willowbrook's thatched roofs, Miss Marple sat at her window with her knitting. Outside, the Black Cat Inn stood dark and silent, all save for one upper window where a faint light flickered as though someone still moved within. "Curious," she murmured. "Very curious indeed." She set down her knitting, leaned forward, and watched the inn across the way until the light went out. Chapter 3. The Man in the Photograph. The morning after the rain dawned grey and chill. The hedges along Willowbrook Lane dripped quietly, and the puddles shone like dull mirrors. Yet inside the village post office, warmth and gossip were as constant as the ticking of the clock above the counter. Miss Marple stood patiently in line behind Mrs. Price and old Mr. Tewson, pretending to examine a rack of postcards depicting roses and thatched cottages. She did not particularly need stamps today, but she had learned long ago that a post office was a more reliable source of information than any detective's notebook. "Terrible business. Terrible," Mr. Tewson was saying. "They say the gentleman had letters from London. Official-looking envelopes. Scotland Yard, I heard." Mrs. Price's eyes widened. "Really now, what could the Yard be writing to him about? Unless, oh dear, unless he was connected somehow." Miss Marple, eyes lowered, smoothed the corner of her envelope and said with mild interest, "Connected, Mr. Tewson?" He turned, pleased to instruct. Yes, Miss Marple. Seems he wasn't just a writer. Mr. Stratton was corresponding with some people in London about, criminal archives or something of that sort. How very intriguing, murmured Miss Marple. One never quite knows, does one, what people are writing about when they say research. She thanked the postmistress, tucked a few stamps into her handbag, and stepped out into the drizzle. The inspector's curiosity, Inspector Crail, had taken up temporary quarters in the vicar's study. For convenience, as he put it, though it was quite clear to everyone that Mrs. Dawlish refused to have policemen cluttering up her parlour. When Miss Marple arrived, he looked up with a sigh that mixed irritation and relief. Ah, Miss Marple, you seem to have a way of knowing things before anyone else. Perhaps you'll tell me what you make of this. He pushed across a small envelope, its contents sealed in cellophane. Inside lay a black and white photograph, slightly faded with a crease through one corner. The image showed a group of 4 people standing before a brick building. At the center was Stratton himself, unmistakable with his narrow face and sharp gaze. To his left stood a heavy-set man in a bowler hat. To his right a woman in a light summer dress. Behind them, barely visible, a shadowed figure half turned away from the camera. The landlord found it in Stratton's suitcase, said Crail. No note, no label. Recognize anyone? Miss Marple studied the picture carefully. No, Inspector, but I do observe a few things that may be of interest. Oh, the lady, Miss Marple said gently, tapping the image, is wearing gloves, quite unnecessary on what appears to be a warm day, and the shadow of that building suggests it is mid-afternoon, perhaps July. Also notice the corner of a street sign in the background. Your street. Crail squinted. So it might easily be Baker Street, Miss Marple finished quietly, which is rather a coincidence given the name of your victim's unfinished manuscript. The inspector frowned. You think it's connected? I think, Miss Marple replied, that coincidences are very rare in murder, Inspector. People are not so imaginative as they like to believe. An unexpected visitor that afternoon brought an unexpected arrival in Willowbrook, a tall, well-dressed woman in a travelling hat, her eyes concealed by a black veil. She descended from the motor coach at the Green, glanced once at the church, then made her way briskly to the Black Cat Inn. Within half an hour, everyone in the village knew that she had asked for Mr. Stratton, and that when told of his death, she had nearly fainted. Miss Marple heard it first from young Tom Dawlish, who had been hovering about the inn since morning. She said she was his sister, he told her breathlessly. Name of Mrs. Grayson, from London. How distressing for her, said Miss Marple softly. Grief so often brings people to the place of loss, though sometimes not entirely for the reasons one might suppose. Tom blinked. You mean? I mean, my dear, said Miss Marple, that people sometimes come to fetch what does not belong to them. Tea with Mrs. Grayson. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had taken the liberty of calling upon the newcomer. She found Mrs. Grayson in the inn's small parlour, eyes red from weeping, but her composure quite intact. The cat slept near the hearth, tail twitching. You are Miss Marple, I believe, said Mrs. Grayson, offering a gloved hand. The inspector mentioned your observations. Miss Marple smiled gently. I am so sorry for your loss. Your brother struck me as a very intelligent gentleman. Curious, perhaps, but kind? Yes, Mrs. Grayson said distantly. He was always curious. Too curious, if I'm honest. He never knew when to leave things be. Writers rarely do, Miss Marple said, glancing about the room. May I ask, were you aware of what he was working on? Mrs. Grayson hesitated. A book of some sort. About real crimes, I think. He said it was partly fiction, partly research. And he came here for that purpose? Yes. There was a story, he said, about this inn. The Black Cat. Some old murder, long forgotten. He said he wanted to set it right. Miss Marple's knitting needles, resting in her lap, clicked softly. How interesting. People often feel compelled to uncover the past, though the past rarely thanks them for it. Mrs. Grayson gave a strained smile. You sound just like him. Miss Marple inclined her head. Tell me, my dear, when you last saw your brother, did he seem, afraid?" Mrs. Grayson looked up sharply. "Afraid? No, only determined. He said he had proof of something, and that once he wrote it down it would all be over." "Proof?" Miss Marple repeated. "Of what?" Mrs. Grayson's lips trembled faintly. "He didn't tell me, only that it was something from his days in London, something connected to a case that was never solved." The photograph. Again. That evening, back in her cottage, Miss Marple laid the photograph on the table beneath her reading lamp. She studied it as one might study a crossword, with patient concentration and a faint, knowing smile. 4 figures, one blurred, one gloved, one shadow falling where it should not fall. She reached for her spectacles and examined the background again. There, half hidden by the woman's hat brim, she saw it, a reflection in a glass window. A 5th person, caught just faintly, holding the camera. "A photographer," she murmured. Or perhaps the subject who wished to remain unseen. Her gaze drifted toward her window, where the moonlight glimmered faintly on the church spire. The village slept, but she had the distinct sensation that someone, somewhere nearby, was also awake, watching the Black Cat Inn with the same quiet vigilance. Miss Marple folded the photograph, slipped it into her knitting bag, and said softly to herself, "Curiosity killed the cat, they say, and perhaps it has done so again." Chapter 4. A Glove and a Whisper. The following morning broke with a curious brightness, a deceptive sunlight that gilded the cottages of Willowbrook as though nothing at all had disturbed their tranquil order. The milk cart clattered cheerfully down the lane, and the scent of warm bread drifted from the bakery. Yet beneath it all ran a quiet tension, a ripple too faint for the untrained eye, but not for Miss Marple. She noticed it in the way people spoke. Just a trifle, too softly, or paused too long before answering. She noticed it in Mrs. Dawlish's trembling hands as she arranged the breakfast cups at the Black Cat Inn. And she noticed, most particularly, in Mrs. Grayson's expression that morning, pale, controlled, and faintly expectant, the inspector's displeasure. Inspector Crail was in no mood for subtleties. He stood at the inn's small desk, examining a sheet of paper with the weary impatience of a man who had slept badly and thought worse. "Blast it all," he muttered. "Nothing from the lab. The port glass was clean. No sign of poison. Heart failure's the only thing left." Miss Marple, who had arrived ostensibly to return a borrowed handkerchief, sipped her tea. "Oh dear," she murmured. So easy to say, and yet so seldom the truth. Crail turned a weary eye upon her. "You've something in mind, Miss Marple, I can tell." She smiled faintly. "Not yet, Inspector, but I've always found that death, when it comes unexpectedly, is very seldom quite alone. There's usually a smaller death before it. Of honesty, perhaps, or peace of mind." Crail frowned. "You speak in riddles." "Not riddles," she said gently. "Analogies." He gave a dry snort, then glanced at his notes. "You mentioned something about gloves yesterday. Found a pair this morning, as a matter of fact. Woman's gloves, black silk. Left behind in Stratton's room." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple, her tone light but her eyes keen. "And Mrs. Grayson does favour black silk, does she not?" Crail nodded grimly. "She claims they're hers. Says she dropped them when she came to identify the body. Could be true." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "It always could be." A conversation overheard. That afternoon the air turned heavy again with approaching rain. Miss Marple, on her way to call upon the vicar's wife, passed the side path that led to the inn's kitchen garden. There she heard voices, low and hurried. She recognized Mrs. Grayson's, strained and urgent, and Tom Dawlish's, young and nervous. "You mustn't keep it," Mrs. Grayson was saying. "If anyone finds it." "But it's not mine, Mom. I told you I only—" "Then burn it, do you hear me? Burn it at once." There was a pause, then the sharp sound of footsteps retreating toward the inn. Miss Marple very quietly stepped out from behind the hedge. Tom stood alone, looking pale, a small parcel clutched in his hands. "My dear boy," she said softly, "you seem quite distressed." Tom started violently. "Miss Marple, I didn't see you." "No, I dare say not. One rarely does see the people who matter most." She nodded toward the parcel. "That looks rather important." He hesitated, flushing scarlet. "It's nothing. Just something Mrs. Grayson dropped." Miss Marple's voice was kindly but firm. "You know, Tom, honesty is rather like yeast. It may seem small, but without it nothing rises properly. Why don't you let me hold that for you? Only for a little while." After a long moment, he handed it over. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, lay a single black glove, the right-hand one, stained faintly near the wrist with something dark and sticky. "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "How curious. People so often lose gloves in pairs, but never quite in the same way." The whisper in the hall. That evening the rain came again, sharp, persistent, rattling the window panes like impatient fingers. The inspector had retired early, grumbling about London interference, while the guests at the inn sat silent before the fire. Miss Marple remained quietly in her corner, knitting. Beside her Mrs. Grayson sat rigidly, pretending to read. From time to time she glanced toward the window as though listening for something. The cat stirred, leapt from the hearth and padded toward the stairs. A moment later a faint whispering drifted down from the upper hall. "Not here," a man's voice said urgently. "It's too late," came a woman's reply. The words were almost lost in the storm, but Miss Marple heard them distinctly. She rose, smoothed her skirt, and moved toward the passage, just in time to see a shadow flit across the landing above. The whispering ceased. Then came the soft sound of a door closing. When she returned to her seat, Mrs. Grayson was gone. The burned paper. At dawn the storm had passed. The air smelled of damp earth and chimney smoke. Miss Marple, walking along the lane behind the inn, came upon the little rubbish heap where refuse was burned. The ashes were still warm. She prodded gently with her umbrella. Among the blackened scraps of paper, one corner remained unburned, a fragment of a letter. The ink had run, but a few words could still be read. "Cannot keep it quiet any longer. The man you trusted. Baker Street affair." Miss Marple folded the fragment carefully into her handkerchief. "Baker Street," she murmured. "Yes, of course. That is where the story truly began." The cat's return. That evening, as twilight deepened and the church bells tolled 6, the inn's cat appeared again, wet from the rain, carrying something small in its mouth. It dropped the object at Miss Marple's feet and meowed insistently. It was a silver cufflink, engraved with an unfamiliar crest, a lion rampant, and beneath it the initials R.G. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you, my dear. Cats are such excellent judges of character." She looked toward the upstairs window, where Mrs. Grayson's silhouette stood framed against the lamplight. Then she turned back toward her own cottage, her mind already weaving the threads together. The glove, the photograph, the letter, and the shadowed figure no one had quite seen. "People," she said softly to herself, "always imagine they can hide their truths. But they forget. Even the smallest thread shows upon the surface, if one looks closely enough." Chapter 5. The Baker Street Secret. Morning sunlight found Miss Marple already upon the 9:12 train to London, knitting contentedly as the countryside slid past in autumnal golds and browns. To any casual eye, she was merely a pleasant elderly lady on an errand. But to those who knew her well, there was a certain glint in her blue eyes that betrayed sharper work beneath the surface. At her feet lay a small travelling bag. Within it, carefully folded, were the black glove, the silver cufflink, and the charred letter fragment bearing the words, "Baker Street Affair." She had slept but little, her mind sifting and sorting the clues with quiet precision. There was, she felt, some connection between Mrs. Grayson, the late Mr. Stratton, and that curious address in London, 221 Baker Street, a name that carried even now a faint legend of detection. A visit to Baker Street. By early afternoon the bustle of London surrounded her. Hansom cabs, errand boys, and the clamour of Piccadilly omnibuses. She found her way easily, as though guided by instinct, to Baker Street itself. The house she sought was no longer a private dwelling, but a modest curio shop. Above the door, a fading sign read, W. Meridew, Antiquarian Books and Curiosities. A small brass bell tinkled as she entered. Behind the counter stood a stooped man in a brown waistcoat, spectacles perched precariously upon his nose. "Good afternoon," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I wonder if you might help me. I was told that some years ago a Mr. Raymond Stratton lived at this address." The man frowned, rubbing his chin. "Stratton? Stratton, you say?" "Ah, yes, the gentleman dealer in rare coins. Had a room upstairs for a while, just after the war. Quiet fellow, always in and out with locked boxes." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once. "How interesting. And would he by any chance have entertained visitors?" "Only one that I recall," said the bookseller. "A tall lady, dressed in black. Very elegant. Never gave her name. Came regular, always left before dusk." "Mrs. Grayson, I fancy," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. The man blinked. "You knew her, then?" "Oh, one hears things," she said, smiling faintly. "And what became of Mr. Stratton?" "Disappeared, ma'am. Vanished clean off one winter night. Left his rent unpaid, his trunk locked, and a curious note upon the table. Something about a debt repaid in silence." The photograph in the window. As she thanked the man and turned to go, Miss Marple's gaze caught upon a framed photograph in the shop window. It showed a group of men in military uniform, the edges yellowed with age. And there, unmistakably, was Mr. Stratton, younger but clearly recognizable, standing beside another man whose features sent a faint shock through her. For beside him was a smiling gentleman with the same RG monogram upon his cufflink. She leaned closer, reading the inscription at the bottom. "Royal Engineers, Cairo Division, 1919. Capt. Dar Grayson and Letitar Stratton." "Dear me," Miss Marple whispered. "How very neat. Husband and wife, 2 friends, and one secret too many." A quiet tea on Montague Street. Miss Marple took her tea that afternoon at a small shop off Montague Street, where she often dined when in London. She considered the facts. Stratton and Grayson, army comrades. The widow, now conveniently wealthy. The death by heart failure, and the curious insistence upon silence in the burnt letter. It was not murder for gain alone, she decided. No, there was guilt and perhaps revenge woven into it. Her reverie was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman with a red notebook. She was brisk, neatly dressed, and clearly a journalist. "Excuse me, ma'am," the girl said brightly. "May I borrow your sugar? I'm from the London Chronicle. We're covering that odd death at Willowbrook, the man who died at the Black Cat Inn. Some say it's to do with a smuggling ring from the war." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, it's always to do with something from the war. They left more ghosts behind than graves." A visitor at the door. By dusk Miss Marple had returned to her London lodging, a respectable guest house in Bloomsbury. As she removed her hat, there came a knock upon the door. It was Inspector Crail, his hat dripping with rain and his expression severe. "Miss Marple," he said curtly, "you've been busy." "I do like to be useful," she replied sweetly. He held up a telegram. "We've had word from the coroner. Stratton didn't die of heart failure. Poison, all right. Digitalis. Carefully administered." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Ah, the heart after all. How very appropriate." Crail folded his arms. "And the widow?" "She'll hang herself with her own silk gloves, Inspector, if we let her talk long enough." He gave her a narrow look. "You sound confident." "Oh, not confident, my dear man. Merely observant. The truth is always polite enough to show itself, if one offers tea first." The letter from Cairo. That night, alone by the lamplight, Miss Marple unfolded the charred letter again, studying the faint scrawl beneath the burned edges. The words were nearly gone, yet one phrase remained clear enough to read. the map of the desert cache. She sat back, her knitting idle upon her lap. The cache, she whispered. So that's what the quarrel was about. She turned to her notebook and wrote one line. Grayson's fortune, not inheritance. Stolen treasure? Then, smiling to herself, she folded the paper neatly and rose to ring for the maid. Tomorrow, she said softly, we shall pay a little visit to Mrs. Grayson. I fancy she has been expecting me. Chapter 6. The Widow's Confession. A chill rain had fallen all morning over Willowbrook, softening the edges of the hedgerows and turning the lane to the Black Cat Inn into a shining ribbon of mud. Miss Marple, wrapped in her neat grey shawl, stepped carefully from the hired motor car and regarded the building with mild curiosity. The inn, for all its sinister reputation, looked harmless enough. Ivy about the eaves, lace curtains at the windows, the brass sign newly polished. Yet beneath that tidy facade there lingered something uneasy, as if the walls themselves remembered what had passed inside them. Mrs. Grayson awaited her in the parlor. The widow was dressed in mourning black still, though the year had turned, and her appearance was as composed as ever. But there was tightness about her mouth that Miss Marple did not miss, nor the nervous flick of her fingers upon the teacup. Miss Marple, she said coolly, to what do I owe this honor? Miss Marple smiled in her gentle, almost apologetic way. Oh, my dear, I hardly know if one may call it an honor. I so dislike unpleasantness, but I fear I have come upon something that troubles me. Mrs. Grayson's eyes narrowed. Indeed? Yes, about poor Mr. Stratton. I cannot help feeling that his death was not entirely natural. There was silence, only the faint tick of the clock and the hiss of rain against the panes. Mrs. Grayson set her cup down rather abruptly. You speak dangerously, Miss Marple. The coroner's verdict was clear. Oh, yes, said Miss Marple mildly. But verdicts, like hats, are sometimes chosen for appearance rather than fit. The first crack. Mrs. Grayson rose, crossing to the fireplace. You think me capable of murder? I think, said Miss Marple, that you are a woman of intelligence, and that intelligent women sometimes do foolish things, particularly when they are frightened. The widow turned sharply. Frightened? Of what, pray? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked twice before she answered. Of the past, Mrs. Grayson. Of Cairo, perhaps, 1919. Of the Royal Engineers encampment. Of a certain cache of valuables buried under the desert sand and later recovered. The color drained from the widow's face. You've been reading nonsense. No, my dear, I've been listening. And people talk. Mr. Stratton, I understand, was once your husband's closest friend. A pause, then quietly Mrs. Grayson said, He betrayed my husband. Miss Marple murmured. It's always betrayal, in the end. A ghost at the window. At that moment a tap sounded at the window. Both women started. It was only the cat, the sleek black creature that seemed always to appear at the most dramatic moments. It sat upon the sill, tail flicking, yellow eyes gleaming through the rain. Mrs. Grayson laughed. A sharp, unnatural sound. That wretched animal has haunted this house ever since Mrs. Penfold's time. They call it the Black Cat's curse. Miss Marple regarded the animal thoughtfully. Perhaps it only stays where truth has not yet been laid to rest. The widow speaks. Mrs. Grayson drew a deep breath and turned away. If you must know, Miss Marple. Yes, there was something between my husband and Stratton. A quarrel over money, or rather treasure. During the war they discovered an old Turkish cache in the desert. Gold coins, jewels, relics. It should have been reported to the authorities, but Raymond, my husband, was persuaded otherwise. By Stratton? She nodded faintly. He convinced Raymond they would share it quietly. But when they returned to England, the treasure was gone. Stratton claimed thieves had taken it. My husband never believed him. The strain broke him. Her voice faltered. He took his own life. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And you swore he would be avenged. Mrs. Grayson lifted her head. Wouldn't you? I dare say not, my dear, but then my tempers are mild. The trap tightens. Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but her words were precise as pins. You invited Mr. Stratton to Willowbrook, did you not, under pretense of helping with your late husband's papers? Mrs. Grayson hesitated. Too long. I merely wished to confront him. And when he refused to confess, you slipped digitalis into his port, a medicine you conveniently kept for your own nerves. The widow's breath caught. You have no proof. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her shawl. Proof is a matter for the police, my dear, but conscience, that is for you. Mrs. Grayson's hands trembled upon the chair back. You wouldn't— I shall do nothing, said Miss Marple gently. But Inspector Crail will arrive within the hour. If I were you, I should tell him the truth, before he tells you the evidence he already holds. There was a long pause. Then Mrs. Grayson sank into her chair, her composure collapsing like a mask undone. He ruined everything, she whispered. He laughed, said Raymond had been a fool. I only meant to frighten him, to make him ill. I didn't think it would. I know, said Miss Marple softly. We never do until it's too late. The confession. When Inspector Crail arrived shortly after, the confession was already waiting for him, written in a neat, steady hand. Mrs. Grayson surrendered it without resistance. Tell them, she said, her voice faint, that I loved my husband more than my soul. As she was led away, the cat leapt lightly from the window-sill to Miss Marple's lap, purring with quiet satisfaction. Miss Marple stroked its fur. There now, she murmured. The dead rest easier when the living speak truth. Epilogue of the chapter. That evening, as the rain cleared, Miss Marple sat by her cottage window in St. Mary Mead, letters spread before her, the report from Crail, the formal confession, and a small envelope addressed in Mrs. Grayson's hand. Inside was a single line. The treasure is buried where the cat sleeps. Miss Marple looked up, smiling faintly. How very suitable, she said aloud. Life, like cats, always lands on its feet. And with that she folded her knitting once more, and set about casting on a new pattern, one that required, as she told herself, unusual attention to detail. Chapter 7. The Treasure Beneath the Hearth. It was 2 days after Mrs. Grayson's arrest when Inspector Crail came to St. Mary Mead. He found Miss Marple in her garden, pruning her roses with the air of one who considered every petal a moral lesson. Morning, Miss Marple, he said, removing his hat. I've just come from Willowbrook. Thought you'd like to know. The widow's been remanded. She's confessed all. Quite properly so, Miss Marple replied, snipping delicately. But you look as though there's something still troubling you, Inspector. He gave a half laugh. You've the devil's sight for reading faces. It's this business of Stratton's note, the one we found half burned. The line about the desert cash. What do you make of that? Oh, said Miss Marple mildly. I rather think he meant precisely what he wrote. Crail frowned. A cache of stolen treasure in a village like Willowbrook? My dear man, said Miss Marple, shaking her head, treasure is a relative term. What's buried may not always be gold, but it is nearly always guilt. The cat's secret. That evening Miss Marple returned with Crail to the Black Cat Inn, carrying a small lantern and her usual air of quiet purpose. The innkeeper, Mrs. Barton, met them at the door. The place gives me shivers now, she said. That cat's taken to sleeping by the hearth every night, same spot. Won't budge even when I light the fire. Animals have their reasons, said Miss Marple. We'd best indulge them. She crossed the parlor slowly, her eyes scanning every surface. The hearth indeed looked ordinary. Bricks, soot, and a newly swept grate. But there, near the corner, was a faint irregularity, one tile slightly higher than the others, its mortar fresher. Kneeling, Miss Marple tapped the tile lightly with the handle of her scissors. It rang hollow. Ah, she murmured. As I suspected. Crail crouched beside her, prying the tile loose. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity, and within, wrapped in an old army map, a small metal box. Well, I'll be, he muttered. You were right again. Miss Marple said nothing as he lifted the box. Inside was not gold or jewels, but a bundle of yellowed papers, a silver compass, and a locket containing a photograph of two young men, Raymond Grayson and Edwin Stratton, smiling against the endless desert. There was also a single handwritten page marked for Jane Marple, should she care to know. Stratton's letter. Crail looked astonished. He left this. For you? Miss Marple unfolded the paper. The writing was unsteady but legible. If this reaches the right hands, I wish it known that I wronged no man in Cairo. Grayson and I found the cash, relics of the Turks, and returned them to the authorities. The money that followed was his, not mine, but he believed otherwise. I came to Willowbrook to make peace with his widow, to tell her the truth, but her eyes were as cold as the desert stars. She never meant to forgive. I have left the proof of my innocence here, where perhaps justice will one day find it. E. Stratton. Miss Marple sighed. Poor man. So many quarrels begin with misunderstanding and end with tragedy. Crail read over her shoulder. So the treasure wasn't gold, it was evidence. Precisely, and proof, she added quietly, that Mrs. Grayson killed an innocent man. Justice and Pity Crail folded the letter. I'll have to bring this to the magistrate. It may alter the case. It should alter the heart more than the sentence, said Miss Marple softly. The law can hang her, but it cannot forgive her. Only truth can do that. They replaced the hearthstone, leaving the cat to curl once more upon it. It purred, as though satisfied. Outside, the air had turned clear and cold. Crail, lighting his pipe, glanced back at the inn. You know, Miss Marple, I'd give a year's pay to see inside that mind of yours. How in heaven's name did you guess about the hearth? She smiled. Oh, Inspector, cats and people both sit where warmth once was. It's a habit they share. The quiet return. When she reached her cottage that evening, Miss Marple found a small parcel waiting upon her table, forwarded from London. Inside was a worn book of essays on logic and observation. On the flyleaf, in elegant handwriting, were the words, To Miss Jane Marple, a kindred mind, if ever there was one. From the desk of Dr. John H. Watson. She sat very still, the faintest colour rising in her cheeks. How curious, she murmured. One never knows who reads one's letters. Then she smiled to herself, replaced the book upon her shelf, and turned to pour her evening tea. Outside, the church bells rang softly over St. Mary Mead, calm and reassuring, as if the village itself had closed one more chapter in the long chronicle of human folly. Chapter 8. The Last Letter from Baker Street. A fortnight had passed since the affair of the Black Cat Inn, and life in St. Mary Mead had returned, as it always did, to its tranquil rhythm. The butcher whistled as he carried his parcels, the postmistress gossiped over the counter, and Miss Marple, contentedly seated in her parlour, resumed the comforting companionship of her knitting needles. The world, she reflected, had a very short memory for murder, which was, perhaps, a mercy. Yet that morning's post had brought her something quite out of the ordinary. A letter with an old-fashioned wax seal, and an address written in a firm, rather distinguished hand. 221B Baker Street, London. Miss Marple regarded it with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. Well, really, she murmured. I was not aware the address still wrote letters of its own. The letter. She broke the seal carefully. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, written in a hand of admirable clarity. My dear Miss Marple, forgive the liberty of an intrusion from an admirer who has long followed your singular gift for discerning truth in the most domestic of tragedies. I have lately come into possession of certain papers belonging to my late friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Among them a reference to a country gentlewoman of remarkable perspicacity in matters of crime, whose methods, he noted, are of the truest scientific spirit, though adorned by intuition and compassion. If, as I suspect, that gentlewoman is yourself, then I am honoured to send greetings on behalf of Baker Street, and to commend you for resolving a matter which touched indirectly upon one of Holmes's unrecorded investigations. The Black Cat affair, it appears, began many years ago with his pursuit of a smuggling ring from the Levant. A thread, alas, left incomplete. You have, dear madam, tied the final knot. With sincere admiration, Dr. John H. Watson. Miss Marple read the letter twice, her blue eyes thoughtful, then set it down with the faintest of smiles. "How very courteous," she said softly, "and how very like men to leave things half done." The gentle victory. Later that afternoon she took her customary walk through the village, stopping by the churchyard to leave flowers upon a newly tended grave, that of Mrs. Grayson, whose heart had failed quietly in her cell 2 nights prior. Miss Marple stood a moment in silence, the petals trembling in her hand. "So it ends," she murmured. "Pride, love, greed, and a little poison between them." The vicar, passing by, paused respectfully. "A sad business, Miss Marple, but you did a great service in uncovering the truth." "Oh, I did nothing at all," she said gently. "I only listened. The world tells us everything, if we have the patience to hear it." A visit from London. That evening, as dusk settled, there came a polite knock at her door. A young man stood outside, tall, fair-haired, and unmistakably metropolitan in manner. He introduced himself as Mr. Miles Watson, nephew of the late doctor. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I was asked to deliver something to you personally." From his coat pocket he withdrew a small, polished wooden case. Inside lay a simple magnifying glass, its handle of old mahogany. "It was my uncle's," he explained. He wished it passed to the woman he once called the Mirror of Holmes. Miss Marple's expression softened. "How extraordinary! But I hardly think I deserve such comparison." He smiled. "Perhaps not in method, ma'am, but in spirit." The quiet reflection. After the young man had gone, Miss Marple placed the magnifying glass upon her writing desk beside her teacup and her half-finished knitting. The evening light caught the lens, casting a circle of brightness across the table, like a small silent spotlight upon her life's stage. She thought of Holmes, that distant, austere genius, and of Watson, the loyal chronicler who saw humanity even in brilliance. Then she thought of Mrs. Grayson, of Stratton, and of the cat sleeping contentedly upon the Black Cat's hearth. "So much cleverness," she said softly, "and yet it is the heart that solves it all." Outside, the bells of St. Mary Mead rang the hour, gentle, precise, eternal. Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea, adjusted her spectacles, and smiled faintly as she turned back to her knitting. The pattern, she noticed, had gone slightly wrong, one small stitch out of place. "Ah," she said, "just like life," and with quiet patience she began to set it right. End of chapter 8. The last letter from Baker Street. Would you like to continue with chapter 9? The Cat Who Knew the Truth, a more reflective epilogue-style chapter that reveals what truly became of the treasure, and the curious legend that grew around Miss Marple's visit to Baker Street. You said 9. ChatGPT said wonderful. Chapter 9 closes the mystery with a quiet human grace, the kind of reflective denouement Agatha Christie herself so often wrote, where the world returns to calm but not without a lingering whisper of mystery. Chapter 9. The Cat Who Knew the Truth. Autumn deepened over Willowbrook, laying a mist across the meadows and a hush upon the hedgerows. The village had begun to forget the strange and dreadful business of the summer. The inn had reopened, the villagers returned to gossiping of gardens and weather, and the Black Cat herself, the silent creature who had witnessed so much, still slept faithfully by the parlor hearth. But among the few who remembered with tenderness rather than fear was Miss Jane Marple, who found herself once more invited to tea at the vicarage, where conversation, as usual, danced between the mundane and the moral. Tea at the vicarage. "My dear Miss Marple," said the vicar's wife, pouring tea with delicate ceremony, "you do seem to attract these dreadful occurrences. Murder follows you like a moth to the lamp." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Oh, I think not, dear. It's merely that wickedness is no respecter of geography, and one meets the same kind of human nature everywhere. The vicar chuckled. Indeed, although I must say, that cat at the Black Cat Inn seems to know more than any human alive. The locals have quite made a legend of it. Yes, said Miss Marple softly, stirring her tea. Animals understand truth in their own way. They have no need of words. They remember by instinct. The whisper of the hearth. A week later, Miss Marple returned briefly to Willowbrook to settle certain small matters with the innkeeper, Mrs. Barton. The inn looked cheerful again, flowers in the window boxes, the air scented with freshly baked scones. "Business is better than ever, Miss Marple," Mrs. Barton said, her face bright. "Visitors come from miles away, all wanting to see the famous cat. They say she guards a treasure beneath the hearth." Miss Marple smiled. "And do you tell them she does?" Mrs. Barton laughed. "I do, of course. It's good for custom." They stepped inside, where the cat lay dozing before the fire. Miss Marple bent down, her eyes twinkling. "Still keeping watch, are you, my dear? Well, you've done your duty admirably." As she stroked its fur, her hand brushed against something hard. Beneath the cat's paw was a small, dusty coin, dull with age, yet unmistakably foreign. She picked it up delicately, examining the faint script etched along its edge. "A Turkish sovereign," she murmured. So the treasure was real, at least in part. Mrs. Barton gasped. "Do you think there's more?" "Oh, I dare say there might be a few such coins scattered about. But perhaps," said Miss Marple, slipping the coin quietly into the mantelpiece crack, "some things are better left to legends." The London article. Not long afterward, an article appeared in the London Chronicle. The Black Cat Mystery. Solved. A lady detective's triumph. A recent affair in the quiet village of Willowbrook has been brought to resolution through the remarkable insight of Miss Jane Marple, whose name, though modestly withheld from official reports, has become synonymous with intuition and justice. The case, linked to certain papers once belonging to the late Mr. Sherlock Holmes, has been described by the Yard as a rare instance of moral logic surpassing criminal cunning. The inn at Willowbrook, now a site of mild pilgrimage, remains open, and its famous cat continues to sleep upon the very hearth where justice, in its quietest form, was at last restored. Miss Marple read the article with gentle amusement. "A lady detective, indeed," she said. "What nonsense! I only noticed what anyone could if they were not too busy to look." An ending and a beginning. That evening she sat by her own hearth in St. Mary Mead, the magnifying glass from Dr. Watson resting upon her table beside a fresh letter from Inspector Crail. "All loose ends tied up, thanks to you. The papers are now in London, and a note of gratitude from the Yard is on its way. They call you the quiet sleuth of the shires. I call you something rarer, the conscience of England." Crail Miss Marple smiled softly. "The conscience of England," she repeated. "Dear me, what a burden that sounds." Outside, the evening settled into perfect stillness. A single candle burned low, casting its light upon the magnifying glass, and beyond it upon a new envelope lying unopened beside her teacup. It bore no address, only a symbol drawn in black ink, a single cat's paw print. The final reflection. Miss Marple gazed at it a long while, her lips curving with quiet understanding. She did not open it. Some mysteries, she thought, were meant to remain half-whispered, like the soft purring of a cat before sleep. She leaned back, the firelight warming her face, and murmured, "The world hides its truth in the smallest places. In teacups, hearthstones, and hearts. But given time, even the quietest eyes may see it." The cat outside in the lane, no one's cat, yet everyone's, gave a single cry, then vanished into the dusk. And in that moment the story of the Black Cat of Baker Street slipped gently into legend, the tale of a London mystery finished by a village mind, and a woman whose understanding of the human heart had once again brought peace to the restless dead. Chapter 10. The Shadow. Returns to Baker Street. The evening was pale and gold in St. Mary Mead, one of those calm autumn twilights when the village seemed to hold its breath between the end of day and the beginning of memory. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, the sound of a piano drifted from the vicarage window, and somewhere a milk cart rattled down the lane. Miss Jane Marple, in her neat parlour on the High Street, was putting the final stitch into a length of blue wool. Her tea had gone quite cold, but she hadn't noticed. Her mind was upon something she'd read that morning in the Times. Baker Street Museum to exhibit rare relics of Sherlock Holmes. She had smiled faintly at that. The world was always so eager to turn truth into exhibition. Still, it had reminded her of the strange adventure that had begun with that curious letter, and the black cat who seemed to know too much. She had just risen to place her knitting aside when a knock came at the door, a knock that was polite, but firm and somehow official. A visitor from Baker Street. Miss Marple. The man on her step was tall, well-groomed, with the serious eyes of someone accustomed to discretion. His overcoat bore the faintest trace of London dust. "Yes," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I am she. You've come quite a distance, I think." "Inspector Alistair Penrose, Scotland Yard," the man replied, bowing slightly. "I've been sent with a rather unusual matter. May I come in?" Miss Marple studied him a moment. The immaculate cuffs, the cautious posture. A man used to playing by rules, but flexible enough to bend them when truth required. "Of course," she said, ushering him into the sitting room. "Do sit down. I was just about to make a fresh pot of tea. It's always useful for truth-finding, I find." Penrose smiled faintly. "So they say at the Yard. Though I've been told, Miss Marple, that you have a way of seeing truth even without the tea leaves." The London envelope. As she poured, Penrose drew from his coat a thin leather folder and placed it carefully on the table. "You may recall the Holmes papers recovered in the Willowbrook case." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, quite remarkable documents, though I suspect of sentimental rather than practical worth." "Perhaps, but one of them has puzzled the archivists." He unfolded a single yellowed page. The handwriting was bold, confident, unmistakably old-fashioned. At the top it read, "To whomever finds this note, beware the shadow that walks behind my name." S.H. Miss Marple's expression did not change. Sherlock Holmes had a flair for the dramatic. Indeed, but this line was followed by a cipher, one we've been unable to break. It references something called the second cat. Miss Marple's eyes flickered. Then your business isn't with Baker Street at all, Inspector, but with Willowbrook." A cipher and a memory. Penrose leaned forward. "You believe it refers to the events there?" "Possibly," said Miss Marple, her gaze distant. "Holmes was fond of symbolism. A cat that watches and a second that hides, two halves of a single truth. The first cat revealed the murderer. The second, I think, conceals what he was trying to protect." "Protect?" "Yes. Men like that, men of intellect, often guard knowledge that others would destroy. Tell me, does your museum still hold Mr. Holmes's old violin?" Penrose blinked. "It does. In a glass case." "Good. You might have someone examine the soundboard, the thin wood beneath the strings. If my instincts are correct, you'll find a small strip of parchment hidden within." The inspector stared at her. "You're serious?" "Quite," Miss Marple said mildly. "I once had a cousin who repaired violins. People hide the oddest things inside them. Love letters, banknotes, even wills." A call from London. A week later, a telegram arrived for Miss Marple, written in brisk official script. "Parchment recovered from violin. Fragment contains cipher identical to one in Holmes' letter. Reference to the black cat returns. Your deduction entirely correct. Deepest gratitude. Penrose, S.Y." Miss Marple folded the telegram carefully and smiled. She had already suspected as much. Holmes, it seemed, had left behind not only mysteries but also warnings, puzzles meant to protect something far greater than any single case. As she tidied the hearth, her eye caught the small paw-print-marked envelope still lying upon her desk. She hesitated, then opened it at last. Inside was a single card. Cream paper, handwritten in fine ink. The second cat watches from Baker Street. When it moves, beware the silence that follows. A friend. Miss Marple sighed softly, placing the card beside the telegram. "Oh dear," she murmured. "I fear London hasn't finished with me yet." The road to London. The next morning she was seen at the railway platform, neat as ever, gloved and composed, her hat perfectly straight. The station master, surprised to see her with a small suitcase, tipped his cap. "Off to visit family, Miss Marple?" She smiled. "Not precisely. I've been invited to Baker Street. I understand there's a cat to attend to." The whistle blew. Steam curled around her like a veil. As the train pulled away toward London, Miss Marple gazed out upon the fields of England, quiet, endless, and hiding as always their small secrets beneath the calm. Chapter 11. The second cat of Baker Street. London was a different kind of beast from the villages Miss Marple knew, louder, hungrier, and altogether too sure of its own importance. Yet as she stepped from the cab onto Baker Street, carpet-bag in hand and hat neatly pinned, she regarded it with the same calm patience she gave to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead. The air smelled faintly of rain and petrol. A crowd of tourists clustered before the Sherlock Holmes Museum, peering up at the familiar facade. To most it was a curiosity, a theatre of nostalgia. To Miss Marple, however, it was a stage that had once held a living drama, and perhaps still did. The keeper of relics inside, the museum was dim and reverent, its rooms preserved as though Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson had merely stepped out for a case. Glass cabinets gleamed with polished pipe stems, dusty journals, and framed clippings of the Times. A man appeared from behind the counter, tall, narrow-shouldered, and clearly irritated by the intrusion. "I'm afraid we're closed for private inventory, madam," he said crisply. "Unless you have an appointment." "I do indeed," Miss Marple replied, offering a folded letter. "Inspector Penrose asked that I might see your collection, particularly the violin." The man blinked, glancing at the signature. His tone changed at once. "Ah, you must be Miss Marple. We've been expecting you. I'm Mr. Reeve, the curator." She gave a modest nod. "How very kind. I promise not to disturb the dust too much." The violin case. Mr. Reeve led her upstairs to a small parlor where the violin lay beneath glass, bathed in gentle lamplight. It looked perfectly ordinary. Plain wood, time-darkened, unstrung now, but with a certain quiet dignity. "You'll see," he said. "There's no sign of damage. Scotland Yard took the liberty of removing the back plate last week. With great delicacy, I assure you. Inside was a folded strip of parchment, which they have since removed." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And in its place, I imagine, they left something else." Mr. Reeve frowned. "Something else?" She bent closer to the violin, studying the empty cavity. At its center, faintly glued to the inner surface, was a scrap of black paper, barely visible. On it, in tiny copperplate, were the words, "The cat has 2 lives." Mr. Reeve stepped back. "I never noticed that before. What does it mean?" Miss Marple straightened her hat thoughtfully. "It means, Mr. Reeve, that the first message was meant to be found, and this one was meant to remain. Someone wanted to know whether the violin would truly be opened." "You think the thief left it?" "No," she said quietly. "I think the writer of the original cipher left it, Holmes himself. It is his final riddle." A death in the museum. That night Miss Marple took lodging nearby, a modest room overlooking Marylebone Road. Rain fell softly upon the windows, the city's hum deepening into the steady rhythm of night. She had just set aside her shawl when a sharp knock came at the door. It was Inspector Penrose, pale and grave. "There's been an incident," he said, "at the museum." Her voice was calm. I rather expected there might be. They walked back together beneath the gas lamps, the streets gleaming wet. Inside the museum's vestibule, a small crowd of constables gathered near the main staircase. On the floor, under a toppled display case, lay the body of Mr. Reeve, the curator. His spectacles were cracked, his hand still clutching a crumpled note. Penrose crouched beside him. Broken neck. Looks like he fell from the upper landing. But this, he held out the note, was found in his hand. Miss Marple leaned forward. The paper bore only 3 words, scrawled in a trembling hand. The second cat. She drew in a quiet breath. Then the message was not meant for him, she murmured. It was meant for me. A silent visitor. Later that night, Miss Marple sat in the curator's office, the remnants of the museum's ledgers spread before her. The gaslight flickered. Somewhere in the building, a door creaked softly. She looked up and saw, silhouetted against the staircase, a cat, black as pitch, with a white mark on its breast like a tear. It stared at her, unblinking, still, then turned and padded down the corridor toward Holmes's study. The door there stood slightly ajar. She followed. On the writing desk, beneath the shadow of the violin's empty case, lay an envelope, cream paper, sealed with dark wax. Miss Marple broke the seal. Inside was a single folded sheet written in the same strong hand as before. If you have found this, you are nearer to the truth than any before you. The second cat is not an animal. It is a man. S.H. Miss Marple's face remained serene, but her eyes glittered in the lamplight. The second cat, she said softly, has claws after all. Chapter Ayus 12. The man who called himself the cat. Morning came grey and uncertain over Baker Street, the sort of London dawn that creeps rather than breaks, mist clinging to cobblestones and the faraway tolling of St. Marilybone's bells swallowed by fog. Miss Jane Marple was already awake, seated at the small writing table of her lodgings, a cup of tea steaming gently beside her. Before her lay the letter from the night before, the one signed S.H., and beside it, the faint paw-print-shaped blot she had noticed at the bottom of the page. She regarded it thoughtfully. Not ink, she murmured, but wax. Black sealing wax, a modern affectation. Someone wished to echo the past. A knock came, soft, hesitant. The gentleman with the gloves. Come in, said Miss Marple. The door opened to reveal a man of perhaps 40, handsome in the polished, weary way of London professionals. His suit was impeccable, his manner restrained, but there was an intensity in his gaze that did not belong to polite society. Forgive me, Miss Marple, he said, bowing slightly. My name is Julian Hartwell. I understand you are assisting the police in their inquiries regarding Mr. Reeve. I have spoken to them, yes, said Miss Marple, her tone mild. Are you connected with the museum? In a manner of speaking, he replied. I'm one of its trustees, though my family's association with Baker Street is rather older than that. Miss Marple looked at him over her spectacles. Older? You mean perhaps hereditary? Hartwell smiled faintly. You could say that. My great-grandfather was a solicitor who once handled the estate of Sherlock Holmes. Not that there was much to handle. Holmes was never one for wealth, but certain papers passed through his hands. I've made a study of them. How interesting, said Miss Marple softly. And what brings you to me? Hartwell's expression darkened. I think you are in danger, Miss Marple. There are those who don't wish the so-called second cat to be discovered. A web of inheritance. They sat across from each other as the fog thickened against the window. Hartwell spoke with the quick precision of a man long accustomed to concealing more than he revealed. It began, you see, with a letter written by Holmes near the end of his life, he said. It referred to something called the Cat of Two Lives. The Yard thought it metaphorical. I think otherwise. I believe Holmes uncovered a criminal network that operated under his very nose, one so embedded in society that even he could not destroy it. And you believe it still exists? Asked Miss Marple. I do, and I believe my family was once part of it. Miss Marple studied him quietly, her knitting needles motionless in her lap. "That must be an uncomfortable inheritance, Mr. Hartwell." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I've lived with discomfort a long time." The midnight in the archive. That evening, Hartwell arranged for Miss Marple to examine the museum's private archive, a basement room sealed to visitors, accessible only by key. Inspector Penrose, still uneasy after the curator's death, had assigned a constable to stand guard outside, but the atmosphere inside was none the less heavy with unease. Stacks of parchment, wax-sealed envelopes, and fragile ledgers filled the narrow space. A single oil lamp flickered upon the central table. Hartwell moved toward a locked cabinet. "This is where the violin's parchment was found. There's something more here, something we missed." He turned the key. The door opened with a soft click. Inside lay a small wooden box. He lifted it out and placed it before her. "Holmes's personal cipher box," he said. "Empty now. But look." Etched into the lid were faint initials, almost invisible beneath dust. J.M. Miss Marple frowned. "Not Sherlock Holmes, then?" "Nor Watson." "No," said Hartwell. "That's what troubles me." Before she could reply, a sound echoed from the stairwell, the slow tread of footsteps descending, careful, deliberate. Hartwell stiffened. "We're not alone." The shadow behind the lamp. The door opened a fraction. A thin blade of lamplight cut through the darkness of the corridor. Miss Marple did not move. "Who's there?" A voice answered, low, amused, unmistakably confident. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple, but I believe you have something that belongs to me." The man who stepped into the light was dressed in black, his coat immaculate, his gloved hands folded behind his back. His eyes gleamed like glass marbles, cold and certain. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, inclining his head, "you have served your purpose. I'll take it from here." Hartwell's voice was hoarse. "Good God, you—" "Yes," the man said calmly. "The second cat." He moved closer. "Sherlock Holmes exposed my forebears once. He thought he'd ended us, but families have 9 lives, you see, and so do their secrets." Miss Marple rose slowly, her manner composed. "I see. Then you are not the heir of Mr. Holmes, but of his enemy." "Indeed," said the man with a faint smile. "And you, Miss Marple, you are standing precisely where my great-grandfather once stood when Holmes trapped him." He drew a small pistol from his coat pocket. "But unlike him," he added softly, "I don't make the same mistakes." Miss Marple's calm. Miss Marple's expression did not change. She folded her hands neatly upon the table. "Dear me," she said gently, "men are so quick to repeat the same errors. Violence, concealment, pride. Holmes would have told you that deceit is a poor inheritance." The man laughed quietly. "Holmes is dead." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and so is the light behind you." He turned instinctively, and at that moment Inspector Penrose stepped through the door, revolver drawn. The shot he fired shattered the oil lamp, plunging the room into near darkness. In the confusion there was a cry, the crash of glass. And when the smoke cleared, the man in black was gone, leaving only his hat and gloves upon the floor. Hartwell sank into a chair, pale. "He's escaped." Miss Marple looked toward the open cabinet, where the small box still rested. The initials J.M. seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight's dying embers. "No," she said softly. "He's not escaped. He's merely gone where all shadows go, back into the dark. But he'll return when the light changes." Chapter 13. The Cat's Last Game. London that night was restless, not stormy, but heavy with a kind of waiting stillness. The rain had passed, leaving the streets slick and silver beneath the gas lamps. The hum of carriages and the echo of distant footsteps made the city sound alive, as though listening. Miss Jane Marple, however, was calm. She sat in Inspector Penrose's office at Scotland Yard, her gloved hands folded neatly over a small notebook. On the desk before her lay the items recovered from the museum's basement: a pair of black gloves, a felt hat, and a card. Blank. save for a small inked paw print. Penrose was pacing. He's a ghost, that one. We've had every exit covered. No sign, no witnesses, nothing. Miss Marple regarded the card with mild curiosity. Oh, I shouldn't think he's vanished, Inspector. Men like that are very rarely imaginative. They tend to return to the places where they feel powerful. Penrose stopped pacing. You mean Baker Street again? She shook her head. No, not Baker Street. It would be too obvious. Somewhere associated with the legend, yes, but not the house itself. Tell me, Inspector, has anyone thought to search the Wax Museum? The Wax Museum? Yes, Madame Tussauds. I believe there's a rather dramatic exhibit of Mr. Sherlock Holmes in his study there, is there not? If one wished to hide in plain sight, among ghosts and legends, it would be the ideal refuge. Penrose stared at her. Miss Marple, if you're right. I usually am, she said pleasantly. But we shall see. The Waxwork Gallery. It was well after midnight when the two entered Madame Tussauds, accompanied by a single constable. The manager, pale and bewildered, met them with trembling keys. Closed since 10, sir. Not a soul's been in or out since then. I swear it. Let's be certain, said Penrose grimly. The museum was eerily silent. Rows of glassy-eyed figures bathed in dim electric light. The air smelled faintly of polish and old velvet. Shadows clung thick around the wax forms, each seeming to breathe when the lanterns swayed. Miss Marple walked slowly through the exhibits. A small composed figure in her grey coat and sensible shoes, her eyes missing nothing. Then she stopped. At the far end of the gallery, beyond Napoleon and Queen Victoria, was a familiar scene. The study of Sherlock Holmes. The wax Holmes sat at his desk, pipe in hand. Watson stood nearby, moustached and attentive. Behind them on the wall, a violin hung beside a framed letter. And in the corner, half in shadow, stood a third figure. A man. The shadow among wax. For several long moments no one spoke. Then Miss Marple said gently, Good evening, Mr. Hartwell. The man stepped forward into the lamplight. He was pale, his face drawn but resolute. In his hand he held the same small wooden box from the museum's archive. You knew, he said quietly. You always knew it was me. I suspected, said Miss Marple. From the moment you told me your family once handled Holmes's estate. You see, I've met a great many solicitors' grandsons in my time, and none of them carry pistols inside violin cases. Penrose moved slightly, hand near his revolver. Then you killed the curator? Hartwell smiled faintly. Reeve? No. Poor fool tripped trying to open a cabinet that wasn't meant to be opened. I only took what he'd found. But now, he looked at Miss Marple. Now I think you know what the second cat truly means. I do, said Miss Marple softly. It's not a man, nor a symbol. It's a legacy. A name passed from one mind to the next. Men who keep alive the methods of Sherlock Holmes, but without his conscience. Hartwell's jaw tightened. A necessary evolution. The world changed. Holmes's rules don't work anymore. His logic without his sentiment. That's the new way. Miss Marple sighed. And so the cat turns hunter, not watcher. You see, Mr. Hartwell, Holmes sought justice. You seek control. The cat's last game. Hartwell lifted the wooden box. Do you even know what this is? I imagine, said Miss Marple. It's Holmes's final safeguard, the code book that reveals the names of those who misused his secrets, including your own family. He smiled bitterly. You're clever, Miss Marple, but you won't live to open it. His arm raised, the pistol gleaming in the lamplight, and at that very instant there came a strange scraping sound from behind him. A wax figure, the figure of Sherlock Holmes himself, began to tilt forward. Hartwell turned in alarm. What? The mannequin fell with a dull crash, its wooden pipe scattering across the floor. The shock gave Penrose his chance. He fired once. Hartwell staggered backward, the pistol dropping from his hand, and slumped against the waxwork of Dr. Watson, which toppled down with him. When silence returned, the only sound was the faint hiss of gas through the museum pipes. The final secret. Later, back at the yard, Penrose placed the wooden box before Miss Marple. She opened it carefully. Inside lay a single folded parchment, yellowed but intact. Upon it, in Holmes's unmistakable handwriting, "Truth without kindness is cruelty. Reason without conscience is crime." S.H. Beneath the words was a list of names, not criminals, but scholars, detectives, men of law, each of whom had sworn to use Holmes's methods only for justice, never for power. Hartwell's name, inked in another hand, had been added at the bottom and crossed out twice. Miss Marple's eyes softened. So that was it. The second cat was never meant to inherit a crime. Only a lesson. Penrose exhaled. He'll live. Prison, not gallows. She nodded. That's fitting. Some souls must be left to learn. A quiet ending. The next morning, Miss Marple boarded the early train from Paddington back to St. Mary Mead. The countryside rolled past her window, fields washed clean by rain, the first sunlight glinting on the hedgerows. She took from her bag the small note Holmes had once written. "Beware the shadow that walks behind my name." She smiled faintly. "Oh, Mr. Holmes," she murmured, "your shadow has been quite busy, but it seems you left a little light behind after all." The train whistled through the morning fog. By the time it reached the next station, Miss Marple had folded the note away, closed her eyes, and was peacefully asleep, a small grey figure who had once again restored quiet order to a noisy world. Chapter 14. The letter left at Baker Street. It was a week later, and the air in St. Mary Mead had turned brisk with early autumn. Smoke curled from cottage chimneys. Children hurried to school with scarves about their necks, and the church bell sounded gently across the green. The world, at least in outward appearance, was once again peaceful. At Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair by the window, the morning sun glinting upon her teacup, a delicate one of fine china, with a small chip at the rim. She had kept it, she once said, because it reminds one that even the prettiest things have had a bit of life. The fire crackled softly. A vase of dahlias from her garden stood on the table, filling the room with their earthy scent. All appeared as tranquil as could be, yet Miss Marple was thinking, and thinking very deeply indeed. She had been home only a few days, but something still troubled her. The affair of the Black Cat of Baker Street had ended officially with the arrest of Mr. Hartwell and the recovery of Holmes's lost writings. Inspector Penrose had called it the most remarkable case since the war, though he admitted that half the credit belonged to a certain elderly lady with an inconvenient knack for seeing what isn't there. Miss Marple had smiled, thanked him, and returned to her roses. But in her mind the puzzle was not quite finished. Not yet. The unexpected visitor. There was a knock at the door, brisk, polite. Her maid Florence answered it and returned a moment later with a puzzled expression. "It's a gentleman, ma'am. From London. Says his name's Mr. Finch. He insists it's a matter of importance." "Show him in, Florence," Miss Marple said, setting aside her knitting. The visitor was a thin, nervous man in a dark overcoat. His eyes darted about the room as if measuring its safety. In his hand he carried a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. My name is Finch. I'm a clerk at the archives of Scotland Yard. Inspector Penrose asked me to deliver this to you. He said it was found yesterday morning at Baker Street." Her eyes brightened, though her expression remained serene. "How interesting. On the doorstep, was it?" "Yes, ma'am. Addressed to you personally." He handed her the parcel. She thanked him, offered him tea, which he politely declined, and saw him off with her usual kindness. When she was alone again, she untied the string and unfolded the paper carefully, like one might open an old letter from a dear friend. Inside was a single envelope sealed with black wax stamped in the shape of a cat's paw. The message from the shadows. Miss Marple broke the seal with her knitting needle. Inside was a folded card. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neat, deliberate, but with a faint tremor in the ink, as though written in haste. To Miss Jane Marple, the game you played was most elegant, and your victory well deserved. But do remember, where there is one shadow, there are others. The second cat is dead, but the third watches still. Respectfully, a friend of the great detective. Miss Marple read it twice. Then she smiled, a small, wry smile as if at some private gist. "So," she murmured, "we've moved on to a third cat, have we? I should have expected as much. The world does so dislike being without its mysteries." She folded the note, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it neatly inside the pages of her Bible, somewhere between Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Reflections. Over tea. Later that afternoon she took her tea out into the garden. The sun was low, the air full of the scent of earth and rain. A robin perched on the fence, watching her with bright eyes. She poured a little milk into the saucer beside her, and smiled as a grey tabby from the vicarage came to drink. "You're a sensible creature," she said. "You never chase shadows unless there's something real behind them." Her gaze wandered toward the distant hedgerows, where the last light of the day glowed gold upon the fields. She thought of London, of dark streets, wax figures, and the echo of Holmes's voice whispering through time. It occurred to her, not for the first time, that the world had grown more complicated since Holmes's day. Motives were murkier, lies more artful, crimes less about gain and more about pride, and yet beneath all of it, the human heart remained the same, fragile, foolish, and so easily led astray. She sighed softly, then chuckled to herself. "Well, Jane," she said, addressing no one in particular, "perhaps it's as Mr. Holmes would have said. There is always another case waiting at the door." She finished her tea, stood up, and carried the tray inside. The epilogue. A whisper at dusk. That night, as the church bell struck 9, Miss Marple sat once more by the fire. The flames flickered gently, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind stirred the garden gate. Creak, click, creak. A soft rhythmic sound. She glanced toward the window. For a fleeting instant she thought she saw movement beyond the hedge, the silhouette of a man in a dark hat. Then it was gone. Miss Marple's expression did not change. She merely reached for her teacup and murmured, "Well then, the game goes on." And with that she returned to her knitting, calm, untroubled, her needles clicking softly in the quiet house of St. Mary Mead, while somewhere far away in London a new mystery began to stir. Chapter 15. The Third Cat. The following morning in St. Mary Mead dawned clear and golden, the sort of morning that made one believe evil could never thrive in such a place. Dew clung to the grass, the church bell chimed softly in the distance, and a milk cart rattled past Miss Marple's cottage just as she drew aside the lace curtains. All appeared as peaceful as it had ever been. And yet, as so often in Miss Marple's quiet world, appearances were rarely to be trusted. She took her tea to the breakfast table, unfolded the Times, and read through the headlines with her usual keen interest. Politics, scandal, foreign affairs. None of these held her long, but one small column on the second page caught her attention. Mysterious theft at London Museum. A rare violin believed to have belonged to Sherlock Holmes was reported missing late last night from the newly restored Baker Street exhibit. Authorities believe the crime occurred between midnight and 2 a.m. The display case showed no signs of forced entry. Miss Marple's teacup paused halfway to her lips. The violin. She recalled it vividly, the very instrument that had hung in the Wax Museum's reconstruction of Holmes's study. She remembered the faint crack along the bridge and the small engraved initials, SK, almost hidden by age. Setting down her cup, she whispered to herself, "Oh, my dear Mr. Holmes, someone is still playing your tune, The Visit from Inspector Penrose." By noon, Inspector Penrose himself appeared at her gate, looking both harried and slightly embarrassed, which Miss Marple found encouraging. Men of his type rarely came to see her unless the case was properly impossible. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat, "I thought you ought to know. There's been another incident." "The violin?" she asked. "Pleasantly." He blinked. "How?" "Good heavens, how did you know?" "Oh, the paper mentioned it," she said, pouring him tea. "And really, Inspector, it was only a matter of time. One cannot destroy a legend without stirring up those who depend on it." He gave her a weary smile. "You make it sound almost inevitable." "In human nature," said Miss Marple, "almost everything is." She motioned for him to sit. "Tell me, please, who discovered the theft?" Penrose hesitated. "A watchman. Poor fellow swears he heard violin music in the middle of the night. Thought it was his imagination. When he checked, the case was empty." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled faintly. "And was anything left in its place?" He frowned. "As a matter of fact, yes, a single black feather." She leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Not the mark of the second cat, then. Something new. Something testing." The letter in the drawer. After the inspector had gone, Miss Marple returned to her writing desk, the same small oak one where she kept her garden ledger, her church accounts, and her private notes on human folly. From its top drawer she drew the envelope she had received the day before, the one sealed with the cat's paw. She studied it for a long moment. Then, with a small decisive movement, she turned it over. There, almost invisible beneath the fold, was another mark, faint, pressed into the paper rather than written upon it. It was not a paw print this time, but a symbol of 3 slanted scratches, like the marks of claws. "The third cat," she murmured. "He's already begun." She slipped the letter back into the drawer, locked it, and pocketed the small brass key. Evening in St. Mary Mead. As dusk fell, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village. She paused to chat with Mrs. Price about her begonias, with young Tommy Hewitt about his school lessons, and with the vicar about the new hymnals. No one would have suspected that, beneath her pleasant smile, her mind was tracing invisible threads between London's stolen violin and the shadow that had now reached her doorstep. Returning home, she found a small parcel waiting on her doormat. No name, no address. She carried it inside, unwrapped it carefully, and discovered, to her mild surprise, a single object within, a violin string coiled neatly and tied with a ribbon of scarlet silk. There was also a note, unsigned in fine handwriting. "Every melody has a counterpoint, Miss Marple. You heard the first tune in Baker Street. But can you follow the second, hidden in the quiet village? The third. Cat." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she looked up toward the mantel, where her small clock ticked with calm precision, and said softly, "So the game has moved to St. Mary Mead, has it? Very well. We shall see who is truly playing whom." The final scene. That night, under the silver light of the moon, Miss Marple sat by her open window. Somewhere down the lane a violin began to play, faintly, sweetly, almost sorrowfully. The tune was unmistakable. "The Last Rose of Summer." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Ah," she whispered, "so that's your message." She closed her window gently, turned down the lamp, and went to her writing desk. On a fresh sheet of paper she wrote, "Case notes. The third cat subject. Unidentified. Possibly connected to previous Baker Street affair. Current location, St. Mary Mead. Observation. Intelligent. Theatrical. Fond of riddles. Action. Watch. Wait. Listen." Then she laid down her pen, folded her hands, and smiled. For though the night was long and the shadows deepened across her quiet garden, Miss Marple knew one immutable truth. The world would always have its darkness, but as long as she could see clearly, there would always be light enough to solve it. Chapter 16. The Music of Midnight. A prelude to Miss Marple and the Music of Midnight. The evening of the Marleycombe Harvest concert had begun as a perfectly ordinary village affair, cheerful, polite, and altogether harmless. The church hall had been scrubbed and decorated with orange chrysanthemums and late autumn ivy. The piano was tuned, more or less, and Mrs. Weatherby had spent all day preparing sandwiches that were, by universal agreement, mostly bread. Miss Marple, seated discreetly in the third row, smiled with gentle amusement as the women's choir performed their opening hymn slightly off-key. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and wool coats. Around her, the villagers murmured their admiration, fanned their programs, and whispered about who had brought the plum wine instead of proper sherry. To all outward appearances, it was the very picture of small-town serenity. And yet, beneath the laughter and applause, Miss Marple felt that curious tingle she always trusted, the faint warning that something just beneath the surface was wrong. The violinist from London. After the interval came the guest performance, a London musician of some note, invited by the vicar's niece. He was a slender young man named Julian Venn, with dark eyes, delicate hands, and an almost unsettling composure. His violin gleamed in the light like liquid amber. As he raised his bow, a hush fell across the hall. The first notes drifted through the air, low, mournful, hauntingly beautiful. It was the last rose of summer. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. That tune again. It was the same melody she had heard whispered outside her window only nights before. The same tune mentioned in the note from the third cat. Her heart beat just a little faster. She studied the young violinist with quiet intensity. His eyes were closed, his face calm, his fingers moved with effortless grace, but there was something odd in his expression. Not merely concentration, but a kind of defiance, as though each note were being played for someone unseen. The final chord faded into silence. The audience burst into applause. Mr. Venn bowed, smiled faintly, and left the stage. Miss Marple sat very still. The sudden silence. Moments later, a commotion began near the vestry door. A woman screamed, chairs scraped, and the vicar rushed forward. Miss Marple rose immediately and followed the murmuring crowd. Behind the stage curtain, on the narrow corridor leading to the dressing rooms, lay the body of Mr. Julian Venn, his violin beside him, the bow still in his hand. He was quite dead. No blood, no wound, only a peculiar stillness, as though the life had been quietly drawn away. On the floor beside him was a folded piece of paper. Miss Marple bent down, careful not to disturb anything, and read the message written in dark ink. The melody ends, but the game continues. 1 rose has fallen. 2 remain. Midnight waits for all. The third cat, Inspector Penrose. Arrives by dawn, the Marleycombe Hall was swarming with police. Inspector Penrose, weary but alert, stood beside Miss Marple as she surveyed the scene. "No sign of struggle," he muttered. "Doctor says the heart simply stopped. Could have been poison, shock, or something I've never heard of." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "It was fear." Penrose frowned. "Fear?" "Yes. There are certain fears so profound that the body cannot bear them. But the question, of course, is, what did Mr. Venn fear?" She turned toward the stage, her eyes tracing the pattern of footprints on the polished floorboards, the scuff marks by the curtain, the faint scent of candle wax mixed with something sharper. Perhaps cologne, perhaps chemicals. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "would you be so kind as to find out who tuned the piano tonight?" "The piano?" he asked, startled. "What on earth has that got to do with But Miss Marple was already moving toward the instrument, her fingers hovering just above the keys. She pressed one, and a faint metallic rattle answered from inside the case. She lifted the lid, and there, nestled among the strings, was a single coiled wire, a violin string, taut and glinting faintly in the lamplight. Tied around it was a narrow ribbon of scarlet silk. A whisper beneath the music. Miss Marple stared at it for a long moment, her face unreadable. "So that was your stage, was it?" she murmured. "Your music box of death." She turned to Penrose. "Inspector, I think our third cat is quite the performer. He or she does not merely kill, they compose." Penrose's face paled. "You mean this was planned? That man's violin was part of the performance," Miss Marple said, "and perhaps not even his own. I should very much like to see where he acquired it." The midnight note. That evening, as she returned to her cottage, the church clock struck 12. The moon was high, silvering the hedgerows and rooftops. On her doorstep lay another note, small, folded and tied with the same scarlet ribbon. She opened it slowly. "You follow the melody well, Miss Marple, but beware. Every song has a final verse." She read it, folded it, and smiled faintly. "Well," she said aloud, "if it's a concert you want, my dear cat, I dare say I can keep time." She closed the door, drew the bolt, and set her lamp low, while outside, somewhere among the still hedges of St. Mary Mead, the faint sound of a violin rose once more into the midnight air.